So my name is Ethan, and I did the podcast Constitutional, the episode Race. So the summary of the entire podcast, I'll just go over this real quick. Um, the summary is the Civil War gave 3 new amendments that basically was the first time ever that they kind of like changed the Constitution. Those amendments gave rights to people of color, but were not actually being exercised in real life, which led later on to 1950s civil rights movements. Yeah, civil rights movement 100 years later had to fight for those rights to actually be given to African Americans. And that's basically it for the summary. So the 13th Amendment, it was the first time that they were changing the wording or the words on the actual Constitution, and it abolished slavery and had weird phrasing about how the Supreme Court should handle it. And I actually have the little 13th Amendment right there on the right. Section 2, Congress shall have power to enforce this article. Apparently, there was a problem after Reconstruction, and we'll get into that later. Passed through Congress just fine, but had trouble in the House because the House actually had to have all the states ratify it. So the solution was that Andrew Johnson forced the southern states, in order for them to re-enter into the Union after the Civil War, they had to ratify this 13th Amendment, and then they also later on had to ratify the 14th Amendment. So the 14th Amendment gave citizenship to ex-slaves. President at the time, Andrew Johnson, actually vetoed the passing of this amendment, and although it was vetoed and had a lot of people not really liking it, it was basically kind of a compromise. The podcast said that after it was passed, people weren't happy. They weren't like, yeah, celebrating in the streets like they were with the 13th one. And it was overall just kind of not exactly like a great time. But they did actually ratify it, and people weren't against it. But eventually people would go against this one. So the 15th Amendment and Reconstruction. So the 15th Amendment said nobody could be allowed to vote based off race. Wait, I think I wrote that wrong. It should be 15th Amendment said nobody cannot be allowed to vote based off race, something like that. But they basically said that you can't deny someone the right to vote, and that actually led to people having problems because they found ways around it, like the poll tax and the literacy test, which were like super racist, and they basically found ways around to stop the people that they didn't want from voting to vote. And then the Reconstruction was a period after the Civil War where its main goal was to try to get back together the North and South, and yeah, basically just process of bringing together the U.S. after the Civil War. The Reconstruction was actually said to be a pretty like good time in the U.S. for equality. It was up and on the rise. It was like equality wasn't exactly like a major thing, but they did have the guy on the right here is the first ever person to be or the first ever black person to be elected as a politician, and that happened during Reconstruction. So it was like a little bit more equality going on and push for that during this time. And then right after that, they had the Ku Klux Klan, which is extremely famous for being the most racist group ever. Well, definitely not ever, but in America, you know. And after Reconstruction, there was a brief point of things looking up in terms of equality, like I just said. And then the KKK was formed of Confederate veterans. So the soldiers of the Confederacy basically didn't like what they were seeing, didn't like that they weren't being able to oppress the people they want. So they formed the KKK, where a very violent group that killed black politicians and spread throughout the South. They didn't just kill black politicians, they basically aimed at anybody that was considered supporting equality. This included black people, but it extended to just about anybody supporting equality. A really terrible time for the U.S. It spread throughout the South. Basically, well, I put that just to basically say that it wasn't just like in Tennessee where it started. It was basically everywhere now. This racism was starting to get revived. So the revival of racism after the Ku Klux Klan, you also see a total revival of racism. People kind of start to assume in the 1890s after the Ku Klux Klan and stuff like that, that the black people are just not capable of being in democratic government. And there's overall it's a total step back after Reconstruction, just a total U turn, starting to get to the most racist point in America, apart from slavery, States devise ways of keeping them from voting by keeping them from the polls. Like I said, the poll taxes and then the literacy tests, which were all racist. And they said something like every single black person failed the literacy test, while every single white person succeeded, which is impossible. So cases for racism. It wasn't just people like people that were in politics and stuff like that. It wasn't just regular people, non-politicians. Many cases during this time would ruin the gains of Reconstruction. These are Supreme Court cases. The Cruikshank decision, where the Supreme Court went back on the 14th Amendment and decided to not get involved in a massacre of 100 African Americans. These white supremacists basically massacred 100 African Americans. And the Supreme Court basically said, no, that's up to the states to decide, even though the 14th Amendment gave these people the same protection and the states was ruling against that. So basically went against that 14th Amendment. And then the Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court ruled segregation was constitutional, allowing segregation on trains. And so the Jim Crow laws basically had separate trains for the African Americans, and this the Plessy was the guy who wanted to not be on that train, and basically Plessy Ferguson, the Supreme Court just ruled that separate but equal was the way to go, and so they had not just trains, but just about everything you could think of was starting to get segregated at this point. Um, so Plessy case made separate but equal the law of the land. Racial segregation found itself upon the separate but equal claim. This would continue all the way till civil rights revolution. If you ever talk to someone, or I guess you can't really talk to people that much, they're always pretty old nowadays, but I was going to say if you talk to someone that experienced segregation, usually this is what you'll hear, something about separate but equal. And it's not just people that experience segregation, but it's people during this time that were on this time, they would hear this because it was basically backed up by this case, Plessy versus Ferguson, which was a Supreme Court case, meaning it was all the way to the top, and they decided it was okay for segregation to happen. And then you can see on the right just basic segregation. That's just a picture, but yeah. So after basically equality was at all-time low since Reconstruction, and the Supreme Court case Brown versus Board of Education showed things might be moving towards equality. So it was a total roller coaster. They went all the way down, and I think just like during Reconstruction, where you saw a like violent reaction to this like move towards equality, it's now on the exact opposite. This move towards inequality is going to see a reaction that's going to move it towards equality, right? So Brown versus Board of Education showed things might be going up, and basically this case just ruled separate but equal is not right. It's unconstitutional, and basically it got rid of the ability for schools to say or to only allow white people. Yeah, the case ruled that segregation in school was unconstitutional. All the words were in the Constitution, and finally the courts were recognizing that. So the words were already there. The words of saying that they had the right to vote, they were being protected by all the same laws, but it wasn't being actually given to them. It wasn't being exercised, and now you finally see that the courts are actually starting to rule by their own laws that they had, and you get the Brown versus Board of Education. Although that's not the only case, it's the major one that basically signaled maybe this might be the time. And then you have a bigger move towards civil rights in the 19 after that, which happened in 1952. A bigger movement. You have MLK, Rosa Parks. Those people kind of come up during this time, and you see a much bigger movement at a very although I guess not that quick, a kind of quicker movement towards equality finally. Of course, it's always not there. I don't even think we're totally equal now, but civil rights movements would see protests pushing harder for racial equality. Many people would push against this, but now courts were siding against those. One of the last major things that the podcast mentioned was like the one of the last major things for this equality movement was, or the civil rights movement, was the banning of poll taxes and literacy tests, which was like huge. Now they actually do. Now people actually, these African Americans actually do have the right to vote and can actually vote based off that. And yeah, so there you go. Racism in America. That's the it. That's the end. I think that's it. Yeah. Thank you.